don't want this to be super salesy or anything. So I'm happy to answer any questions about the product, but also any technical questions about challenges, things that we had to solve, all that sort of stuff. Alrighty.
Thanks.
Cool. So this is Laravel Nightwatch. It's a observability tool specifically made for Laravel applications. It kind of covers three main kind of aspects of observability. So it does performance monitoring, it does error tracking, and it also does logging. So it kind of rolls those things all into one product and connects all of that data together. So if you're looking at a log, you can jump to the request where that happened. You don't have to kind of match up timestamps between different systems or anything like that. I'll go through a few of the pages, but I don't want to kind of spend a lot of time kind of going through it. But if anyone has any specific questions, we can dive into any of that. So we've got a dashboard that gives you an overview of your application. I'm going to skip past issues for a second and just jump into my favorite page, which is the requests page. So Laravel, being a web-based framework, mostly deals with incoming requests. And this is the thing that most of our users will interact with, is requests. So this is where they're going to experience performance issues and errors. So on this page, we can see a breakdown of all the requests that have come in over the last hour, all the way up to the last 30 days. And we can kind of see a breakdown of successful versus unsuccessful requests. And we can also see performance metrics, so the average and the P95 duration of requests. This is like an overall kind of stats. And then we've got a breakdown by route. So every route in your system, you can see the breakdown of the statuses, the request response statuses, and also the durations, average and P95 durations of each individual route. So this is kind of to give you an overview of what's going on in your system and be able to quickly identify things you might want to dive into a bit further. So if we've identified a problem with, let's say, this post to this flights endpoint, it's got errors, it's got performance problems. So we can dive into that one. And now we can look at just this individual route. And we can see a breakdown of the stats for just the route on its own. And then we can see individual requests coming into the application. Any requests that have had an unhandled exception, we get the error message showing right up here. And if we find one we want to learn a bit more about, we can dive in. And now we're looking at an individual request into the application. Now, this request had an unhandled exception, so we promote the exception card to the top of the page so you can see the exception and stack trace. And then we have kind of overall stats about the route, all these sorts of things. And then we have the timeline. So this is where we can see kind of a breakdown of all the things that happened inside this particular route. So we can see that it was slow because it was sending a notification, and it also had a query exception that caused the error. We can jump to view this individual exception as well. So we have our exceptions section here, where we can see other occurrences of that exception. And we have similar breakdowns for things like jobs and commands and scheduled tasks. These are kind of containers where, like, the kind of entry points into your system. They're not generally slow by themselves. They're slow because things happen inside them. And those things that happen are these sorts of things. So queries, notifications, all that sort of stuff. So you can go to look at queries in isolation of the rest of your app and kind of see every database query and kind of overall timings for it. And this can be kind of interesting because you can see whether there's a query that maybe if I go to like the 30 days, you can see this query here. It's pretty quick, but it runs so often that it spends, cumulative time in the database that's, pretty high for this particular application. We can click on a query and get stats about it, and then we can jump to all of the individual times this query was called. So in this case, it was always in this flight controller on this request. We have our logs section as well. Any log context comes through. We've got filters for all the different log levels, all that good stuff. And last of all, I want to show the issues page because this is probably the thing that we've been working on the most since the last kind of public demos. I think we had a version of this. The way that it kind of works now is issues are they're scoped to the application. So one thing I kind of didn't mention is we have an application switcher at the top here. So you can set up multiple applications inside different organizations, and different applications can have different number of environments. Issues we kind of track to the whole application because an issue might occur in multiple environments. So we can see over here, these ones have all just happened in our production environment. But if this was occurring in multiple environments, maybe it's happening in staging, you can kind of see that relating to the whole application. And we can jump into any of these issues and see recent occurrences. And if this was happening in multiple environments, we could switch between those and see those recent occurrences. And we've got a full activity log here where if you change priorities and change your assignees and all these sorts of things, we get history here and we can add comments and all that sort of stuff. That was kind of a whirlwind tour. So does anybody have any questions around that? Yeah.
Have you got questions? I've got some questions community have asked that aren't here tonight, but open the floor first. Please ask a question.
Does it work well in mobile responses? We wanted to this one on my phone. Does it work well? Complete sets that one.
I'm having a bit of trouble hearing. Is the app responsive?
Yeah, is it mobile responsive? Was the question. If we wanted to look at Nightwatch on our phones.
Yes. I don't remember the shortcut to go to desktop mode in this one, but yes, it is responsive. There's some things that we have to hide on mobile, mostly the timeline. So in an individual request, the timeline down here, this one doesn't currently work on mobile because it's very, very challenging to make that work. But anytime an issue is detected in your application, we're going to send a notification. And so we wanted people to be able to jump in and view that inside the app directly from their phone. So yes.
What, speaking of notifications, what channels do you support for notifying of an issue? And
so at the moment, we just have email, but we're going to be looking at rolling out Slack and also general webhooks. So you can pretty much hook it up to anything in the world you want to.
Nice.
Does Jobs support Horizon?
Does Jobs support Horizon?
It absolutely does. We're using Horizon for Nightwatch itself, and Nightwatch monitors Nightwatch. So yes, I can confirm it definitely works.
Well, that answers who watches the watches.
Yes.
Michael, I think you had some questions.
Yeah. You're doing multi-environment. Are you doing anything to isolate like multi-region at all? Like if you had your application deployed in different regions?
That's a good question. Hello, Michael. I didn't see you back there.
It's snuck in late.
So there's a few aspects to that. So on any individual request, we capture the server that it occurred on. So if you're running your app on multiple servers, you'll be able to see which server served the request. So that's if you're just doing a load balancing thing all in the same region, you'll know which one handled it, but also if it's over multiple regions. There's potentially a few different ways people might want to set up their applications. So we're still kind of exploring how people want to use it. For ourselves, we are rolling out to multiple regions. And at the moment, we've just got everything production going to the same production environment in Nightwatch so that everything's all kind of together because it's the same application, it's the same environment, but you could create a production Australia and a production US and all those sorts of things if that's kind of how you wanted to split your data up. Because any issues that are attached to the application level, if they occur in one environment and then occur in another environment, you won't kind of get like a doubling up or anything like that. The only thing I wouldn't do is create entirely separate applications for each region because those effectively are completely separate as far as Nightwatch is concerned. Yeah.
Nice. Speaking of, you said that you're using Nightwatch kind of internally in production for things. What impact, if any, does hooking Nightwatch up have on the application's performance? And what's that experience been like in your production applications?
Yeah, so we've got Nightwatch running on Laravel Forge, which is by far our biggest application. It gets billions of events every month. And we were pretty cautious with kind of the rollout of the agent because we didn't want to take it down with kind of when it was in its like beta version. But we had a few initial hiccups. But yeah, these days the memory usage is pretty much unnoticeable. Mohammed has kind of kept an eye on it and found that it's pretty negligible. The agent, it uses a lot of really low level PHP stuff, so we don't get to use fancy things like collections and all that sort of stuff. We try and keep everything really, really condensed. The data that comes from, so like to kind of explain a bit about how it works, the package you install in your application that's collecting metrics, it sends them over to a local agent that's PHP Artisan Nightwatch agent. So it's a local agent that runs on your server. And so the request lifecycle, it just sends things to that local agent. So your request lifecycle doesn't have to send outgoing requests to our ingest infrastructure. It keeps it all internally, and the agent batches it up and sends it every 10 seconds or 6 megabytes, whichever comes first. And one of the things we did to kind of keep the memory usage of the agent low is the data that comes through from the application is already kind of JSON encoded in a string that we effectively just keep concatenating onto another string with commas in between it. So we never kind of deserialize that inside the agent. So we don't have to have the string copy of everything in memory and like the PHP representation of all of that. It just keeps it so that we can easily count exactly how many bytes are in memory for that. So yeah.
That's clever. Speaking of data that gets captured, when there's a post or a book request, do you capture the payload with that?
We don't currently, but we've had quite a lot of requests from our early access customers to do that, and something we definitely want to explore. We just need to figure out how to make that make sense, especially with things like PII as well, because once you start capturing the bodies, then that's opening up a whole lot more data that people may not want to capture. So it'll probably be opt-in with some mechanisms in place where you can filter the data and remove bits and pieces like that. But yeah, definitely capturing the payloads that come in. We'd have to exclude certain things like file attachments that get uploaded. So it'd be more like JSON payloads and form requests and excluding that sort of stuff. I can't imagine we'd capture the response because those can obviously be very, very big. So yeah, it's definitely something we're exploring, but at the moment we don't have that. We also want to add it for because we capture outgoing requests. So if you're using the HTTP facade in Laravel or Guzzle, we capture all those requests, and we want to add the ability to capture the payloads that are sent and possibly received from those as well.
That would be incredibly useful in interacting with third-party APIs.
Does capturing Guzzle capture anything that sits on top of Guzzle? Like if you're using Saloon, for example, would it capture that? Have you tested it? Do you know?
I haven't tested it with Saloon. It just uses the Guzzle middleware and it registers it, I believe, globally. But I think that one you have to add manually yourself. So I guess you can choose what conditions you register it. Whereas when you're using the built-in HTTP facade, that is automatically kind of wired up for you.
Nice.
Yeah, go.
So you mentioned you're using a Laravel Forge, so you've got billions of requests. What's the minimum sort of range where you'd recommend using it where below that point doesn't provide much value? What size application would you say is the minimum that you put it on, if it makes sense?
I mean, I'd put it on anything. The bigger the application, obviously the more events you need. So you might need to enable sampling, things like that. But I put it on my side projects. It really depends on what you're trying to find. Like you might have a low traffic app, but it is still highly critical from an errors perspective. A lot of performance issues don't really present on an application that doesn't have a whole lot of data in it, because most performance issues happen when the database gets lots and lots of data in there, and that's why things are always fast on your local, and then they get slow in production. So on a really small app, the performance stuff, you may not get a whole lot out of it, but there's so many things that can make something slow, like not queuing mail and notifications. You'll see those kind of in the request lifecycle, and just being able to know, oh, if I queued that, then that makes that request respond faster. So it really depends less on the size of the app and more on, I guess, like how critical that it is to have a good user experience for the users of that application.
Questions from the room, or shall I pick from a list of
You got
questions? I have more. So there was a bit of discussion around, obviously, you're not the first in the space for application monitoring, but clearly the first in the space for very targeted Laravel specific things. Do you see Nightwatch as a replacement for the other monitoring tools in the market if you're talking about a Laravel based app? And can you tell us a bit more about what inspired the build of Nightwatch?
Sure. So there's definitely a lot of overlap with other products. There's certain things Nightwatch does that other apps won't do. There's other things that other apps do that Nightwatch doesn't do. So it's kind of like choosing an IDE, right? Like different ones suit different people for different purposes. There's no, one true tool. We think that it's the best way of monitoring Laravel applications. We're obviously very biased, but we've made it very specifically for Laravel applications, rather than kind of trying to make something more generic and figuring out how to fit that in there. So the experience is much more customized to Laravel. Literally just install a package and it connects to everything automatically. And everything in the UI is kind of represented the way it makes sense to a Laravel developer. So we're not dealing with, transactions and spans and all these other sorts of concepts. It's just requests and routes and all those sorts of things. So yeah, and then it doesn't it's application monitoring specifically. So in terms of other parts of your infrastructure, people are always still going to need to use, Prometheus and Grafana and all those sorts of tools to monitor their infrastructure if they're kind of managing that themselves. It won't replace anything like that. You can run it side by side with other tools, which we've done while we've had it in development. We've had it on our internal stuff, but we haven't taken off the other tools we were using straight away because Nightwatch was still in like an alpha stage back then, and we wanted to make sure that if something happened there, we didn't lose that information. So it does. We know that it works with other tools. In terms of what inspired it, it was Laravel Forge. It was Taylor wanting to know specific things about Laravel Forge that he wasn't getting through any of the other tools that we were using. So our first kind of way we explored that journey was Laravel Pulse. So that's our open source self-hosted monitoring tool. So that was the initial version. That was, let's make something cool, open source, self-hosted. There were a lot of limitations though with Pulse because it uses, just the database of your application. So things like, Postgres and MySQL. And once you get a lot of data in those databases are great at handling a lot of data, but they're not great at aggregating that data and running kind of reports on that data. They're great at finding an individual row in a sea of millions, but not necessarily querying all, million or billion rows and finding an average or a P95 or anything like that. So that's when we kind of wanted to see what would be possible if we didn't have the restrictions of self-hosting, if we could use all sorts of, interesting tools. And that's when we kind of explored things like ClickHouse, which is what we ended up using. And that kind of let us just throw so much more data into it, and create this kind of experience where you can start from this zoomed out view and zoom all the way in. Laravel Pulse is kind of zoomed out and things aren't connected together, and that's just by necessity of the technology that it runs on. So yeah, that's kind of what inspired it. Was we wanted stuff ourselves for monitoring Forge.
Yeah, nice. I'm particularly excited by the evolution of that issues tab. That looks to me at first pass like it could be almost a drop-in replacement for Sentry.
Yeah, so this is kind of where your multiple occurrences of the same exception will all get grouped together. So you can still kind of come into the activity section. Here you'll see exceptions grouped by the exception. You can see whether they're handled or unhandled and all that. But this is kind of like the raw data. Whereas the issues tab is kind of the consolidation of that with, adding extra context to it. So being able to kind of collaborate on it, write notes, assign it to people, and just kind of jump to recent occurrences of that. And this record also exists beyond the 30 days that data is stored for. So although these individual occurrences will eventually fall out of the data retention, this record still remains. And so if this exception happens again, it'll just get attached back to this record. It won't like kind of send you a brand new notification if it's not a new occurrence. If you mark it as resolved and it comes back again, then we'll obviously send you another notification. If it happens in a different environment, we can send you a notification. So yeah, this kind of keeps that central grouping of all the times that thing has happened, and the history of that over time as well. And not only does this do exception issues, it's also got your performance issues, so slow routes, all that sort of stuff. So you can track when things go over your configured thresholds as well.
Nice. So you talked about, obviously the inspiration was internal issues, and that would have at least initially highly influenced your development. Has the tool then been adopted and used in the same way you envisaged when you built it through early access, or have you found people using it in ways that you were like, oh, that's unexpected?
There's definitely been people holding it in interesting ways that are different than what I would do, which is fine. It's been really interesting because, I mean, one of the best things about working on this is we're building a tool for Laravel developers, and we are Laravel developers, so we just get to ask ourselves, what would be cool, or what do I want to see here? And when we're using Nightwatch to like debug Nightwatch, then it's like, oh, I really want to know this information, or I want to be able to do this. And so then, you know, put it in the backlog and get to solving those sorts of things. So we've been able to kind of build the thing we want and evolve it that way. But then we've had tons of amazing feedback from our early access customers as well that we've incorporated. So yeah, there are definitely people using it. It's mostly to do with the way that people want to set up their kind of environments and applications and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I think at some point we'll look at adding maybe nicer ways of kind of creating like segments of data for handling like multi-tenancy scenarios and those sorts of things. Nightwatch is a multi-tenanted app, and at the moment we haven't kind of felt the need to have like kind of separate, like use separate environments for each tenant or anything like that. But I think being able to kind of group that data together and scope it and tag it and all those sorts of things will be things that we will definitely want to add.
Nice. Yes, Michael, waving.
You mentioned multi-tenancy, which is a pet peeve of mine.
Yeah.
Have you run up against any issues with like cross database connection relationships and managing any of that kind of stuff?
Yes. That has been my life for a few weeks now. So I mentioned earlier, we're in the process of adding extra regions to Nightwatch. So when you set up a new application, you can choose the data storage region for that application. And so we effectively have multiple Postgres connections and multiple ClickHouse connections that the application can talk to get data. And belongs, like a many-to-many, it belongs to many across connections is not fun. In some ways not possible. So I have created I've got a belongs to on connection and a belongs to many on connection custom relationship that we've made. The other part that makes it more interesting is, and this is probably the case of a lot of multi-tenant stuff as well, is the connection is dynamic. It's not just this model lives in this connection and this model lives in this connection. It's like this model always lives in like the central connection, but this other model here, we don't know what connection it exists on until runtime. And if you've dived into the, eloquent relationships, the way they kind of like new instances and trying to just keep that connection and keep the right connection on there is really tricky. But with the many-to-many, the way Laravel wants to do it is do a join with the pivot table and the kind of the other table. And that works fine if you're querying in the direction where the join of those two tables are on the same connection. But if you're querying in the opposite direction where those are not on the same connection, then you can't do that join. So yeah, I could talk about it for a while.
Bad for business.
Just a follow-up question about regions. If you choose to put your data in a certain region, does that mean everything is contained in that region, or something could be sent to, say, the US? Like if you're dealing with personally identifiable information in logs, potentially.
So-
within one region.
So the region defines where all of your metrics data is stored and also which kind of ingest infrastructure it goes through. It also defines where things like your issues are stored and any comments, all that sort of stuff is stored. If you're accessing, there's not like a separate URL you'll kind of go to for the, the AU version or the EU version or anything like that. So because like you could have one application in one region and one application in another region, so it kind of needs to be able to connect to all of the different regions. So data will get pulled into whichever instance of Nightwatch you're running, but it won't get stored there. It just kind of gets queried and presented to you there. We might look at ways of creating some sort of like a kind of region lock where it makes sure that you always use the dashboard in your region, and that way it would never do any kind of cross-region connections. At the moment, everyone we've spoken to is mostly concerned about where the data is stored and less so kind of like where it travels. So yeah, we'll continue to kind of evolve that feature as people kind of give us their needs. We're also exploring SOC 2 compliance as well, which will inform bits and pieces. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
Marty.
Hey, Jess, it's Marty here. So I already.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you?
Good. Quick one. About
Early
Forge
access
set.
customer number 1, I believe.
Oh, am I? I didn't know
so.
that. That's very personal. When it comes to Forge integration, is that going to become like a toggle switch like it is for things like Horizon and Scheduler and whatnot? Like, is that going to be a more streamlined approach?
Yes, definitely. So the only kind of thing you need to do is add an environment variable with your token. I believe the Forge team is working on something where you can kind of just paste that in through the UI and it'll add it to the environment for you. It'll validate that the token is correct. You haven't typoed it or anything. You still need to install the package though, and kind of commit that to your repo and push it up and all that sort of stuff. So I can't think of any good way to work around that unless it had access to like open up a pull request on your repo. So you'd still have to install the package, but in terms of configuring that in that environment, it'll be a similar experience to Pulse and Horizon and all those things.
That's not a completely insane idea. Like shift
Opening-
does. Yeah, opening account, like shift does that.
Maybe you just SSH in and
You'd be surprised.
Sorry.
Look, I can't even get into my GitHub regularly. Once you start putting in like single sign-on and SAML and all that stuff, don't do it. Don't do it, Jess.
I'm sorry I spoke. Moving on. Now I realize you may not be able to give us much on this, but what are the plan limits? Like I think Taylor did drop on X that there is going to be a free tier.
Yes. So we have a free tier. I don't know. I did check with marketing, and that was something I am allowed to talk about is the free tier. I don't know if I'm allowed to talk about how many events and whatnot you get on those various things. But yeah, we're
naming numbers. Do you think you could give us a feel for what level of an application that might support? If my cat had a blog and my blog was written in Laravel, would my cat's blog be watched on Nightwatch as free tier?
well, it depends how many visits you get to your cat blog.
My cat was not Bronchi cat. My cat was just a regular, like the cat that sat on your shirt.
Mhm.
How social is your cat? How many other cats?
Very little social, no friends.
I mean, I think you can get pretty far with it, especially if you turn on sampling. Then you can get really far with it. It kind of depends on what types of events you're capturing as well. So like at some point, I don't think we have this yet, but the ability to like turn off capturing specific types of events. So if you don't care about your cache hits or you want to filter out specific cache hits, like Static Stash cache hits, I believe Marty, you have a lot of those.
yeah. So So just for context on that, for everyone that's here, the quotas got turned on Tuesday morning, and within 4 hours we had used up our thing because of there's a particular static thing that happens under the hood that sent it into overdrive. So Tim's been talking about filtering out those. Yeah, so I want to come back to that though, because I've just got a sampling question after this one. So yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, I gather it would be like something like Sentry, the more exceptions your application throws or the more things that need to be logged, the quicker you'll hit those limits.
Exactly. Yeah. I guess like the main difference with something like Sentry is they kind of treat like you've got like a budget for exceptions and then you've got like a separate budget for like performance stuff. We've tried to keep things simple. From our perspective, there's, at least at this point, not much difference between an exception and a database query and a request. They're all just, packets of data that flow through our environment. So instead of giving you kind of separate budgets, you just have one overall event budget. And so it does mean though that if you've got like a ton of requests, then you might hit your limit fairly quickly. But you may want to turn on sampling for requests. And I think we're adding a feature so that you can always capture requests with exceptions. And so you could potentially put your sample rate at 0 and then only catch when there are problems as well. So there'll be various kind of strategies you can use to get further with a smaller budget. The other thing we're adding is the ability to configure overages. So you can configure like a spend limit of what you'd like to spend above the plan. And you can do that even on the free plan. So if you are on the free plan and you want, you don't want to go up to the next plan, like up to the first paid plan, but you want to get a few more events, you could, put $3 on it or something and kind of almost build your own custom plan in some ways of events. So yeah, there's quite a few options there. We're hoping it'll be very flexible, and we want to make it useful. Obviously, we also need to make money from it, so we can't have something that's just everyone can get away with free. But we do want to kind of make it, like really good for hobby projects, and also just a great way to start playing with it, and also just the ability to sample stuff and get away with it a lot further. What we kind of found, interestingly, with our early access customers is everyone started off kind of on a completely unlimited plan. And once we kind of started implementing our quota stuff and we had to start testing that, people started, hitting restrictions. They didn't want to turn on sampling because they had it all, and then they had that kind of taken away, which is very understandable. If you start with sampling, then you guess you're more used to it, but then you probably still find you want more. But yeah.
Question related to that.
Yes.
Are the budgets per server, per project, per user account? What does the budget actually apply to?
Fantastic question. So everything's attached to the organization. So the organization is the thing that subscribes to the plan. And then within the organization, you can have lots of different applications, and they all share the same quota from the organization. So it doesn't really matter if you've got thousands of really tiny apps. You don't have to buy a separate plan for each of those tiny apps.
So on that note, Jess, if you have, so thinking of it from an agency model, we've got one client who has we've got a lot of different properties for them. Does that mean that they could live in their own organization with their own quota separate to other clients that may be more generic in nature? So we can separate those plans.
100%. Yeah. So that's kind of how we think the agency model works best, is if each customer, you created a dedicated organization for them. And that way, they don't kind of impact your other clients. If you're managing a ton of clients, you can belong to multiple organizations. You can then invite that customer to it. They could take over paying the bill for it if they're on one of the paid plans. So you can kind of manage that however you want to manage it.
And you mentioned just before with sampling that exceptions will still be captured. If you are using sampling, is that just like the way that Pulse works with sampling, or is it going to be picking out more of the ones that are going to be problematic rather than golden path all the time?
So right now, we just have like a kind of global sample rate that you can choose. I think you can specify a sample rate for requests, commands, scheduled tasks, because those are like those kind of entry points into the system. With Pulse, you could configure a separate sample rate for every individual metric because they weren't really related to each other. Whereas with Nightwatch, if you sample the request at one rate, but then you sample your like queries at a different rate, then you kind of end up with always like this weird incomplete picture. So the way we have made that work is you sample at the kind of entry point into the application. And so if that request gets sampled, then all of its events get sampled. So if you're looking at it, you'd never have this like weird spotty picture. You've always got a complete picture of that particular request. Then in terms of features we're currently adding is the ability that if an exception occurs to basically ignore the sample rate and always capture that exception and probably also the entire request and everything else that happened, because you're probably going to want that. And also the ability to, as we said before, kind of filter out specific events if they're just not of value to you, like cache hits is probably the main one. Everything else is, to me, super valuable.
What about specific brands? If you had, I don't know, maybe a heartbeat route that got hit all the time, like I actually don't want Nightwatch to care about that. That's the one.
Yeah, that's definitely another thing that we're currently working on. So a lot of those things kind of all play into each other. So we've got all those different use cases, and we're just trying to figure out the kind of best approach that solves the problem for the most amount of people. So yeah, definitely want to have the ability to just ignore an entire route, sample everything else, and then exclude, and always include when there's an exception. I think those are kind of, I think that'll cover the majority of scenarios that give you things. The only kind of caveat that I haven't kind of figured out the best way to handle it is if you sample, let's say 10% of your requests, when we show things like your average and P95s, if you're just sampling 10% of requests, those averages and P95s, they should be pretty accurate if you've got a decent number of requests coming in. So if you've got billions of requests and you're sampling 10% of them, then you're still getting a good sample rate. Once you start saying, oh, but also capture any requests that have an exception, then the numbers can get skewed because you've kind of got 10% of like all requests, but then 100% of these like unhealthy requests. And if on that particular route, like that particular exception, if it happens really early in the request and makes what would normally be a slow route really fast because it errors out really early on, then it's going to bring down your averages. Likewise, if there's a route that's normally really fast, but occasionally it times out and has an exception, because you're capturing 100% of those scenarios, but only 10% of the rest of everything else, then it's going to drag the average into a way that's not accurate for that 10%, if that makes sense. So we want to potentially explore ways where if something has been included that was outside of the sample rate, to kind of exclude it from the aggregation stats so that those are still kind of scaled to your sample rate, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's clever. All right. Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.